HM Brig of War Racehorse was wrecked at Langness on the 14th of December 1822 with a loss of 9 men. 3 were Castletown men who bravely went out to rescue the crew, and a further 6 were crew from the ship. Some 89 personnel survived the shipwreck. On Perspective this week, we hear all about the tragic event and its commemoration. Sir William Hilary witnessed the rescue, and the tragedy is credited for the resulting creation by Hilary of an Isle of Man lifeboat service, which later became the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Local historian Charles Gard explained why the commemoration is so important.
Well, it's very appropriate, actually, because 200 years ago this December, brave men from Castletown went out to rescue a ship, and 3 of them lost their lives, and there's no commemoration for this anywhere that I'm aware of. So it was very appropriate that Tony Brown has thought it fit to do this.
And in terms of the racehorse itself, what was it, HMS or
yes,
yeah,
HMS, a Royal Naval ship, a sloop, actually, an 18-gun sloop, and a sloop is a boat with a flat deck with 18 cannons on it. And I looked up the word sloop, and apparently it comes from the Dutch sloepen, which means to glide. So that probably gives you an idea of how they cut through the water. Yeah.
It did glide. I was going to say it glid through the water. It glided through the water as far as Langness, and sadly met a rather tragic end. It
really all goes back to 1765, because that was the year that the British government finally lost it with the Isle of Man and confiscated many of the rights we were smuggling, and we were defrauding the UK government of millions of pounds of revenue a year. So they took the power to govern the Isle of Man and they revested it back into the Crown. So it was the Act of Revestment and the Mischief Act, which I think the clue is in the name there. So the time we get to 1822, the smuggling was virtually gone, but there was still a little bit of it about. And in Douglas Bay here, there was HMS Vigilant, which was a revenue cutter, and she was over here just getting rid of the final bits of smuggling. And she had an accident. She barged into another ship, and she was not safe to sail too far. And the Royal Navy heard about this. Of course, you had to write a letter to England, which took days to get there and down to the Admiralty. And eventually they said, let's send HMS Racehorse over to escort the Vigilant back to Plymouth, where she can be repaired. And just looking up the number of shipwrecks in the British waters, British and Irish waters, there are over 50,000 recorded over many centuries. 50,000 shipwrecks. So you can imagine how dangerous it was travelling by sea before steam engines came in.
And indeed before reliable weather forecasts. I mean, that seemed to have made a big difference to them.
Yes, and lighthouses. And that's the key that plays in this story, because HMS Racehorse, with a crew of about 100, it's incredible, 100 people, 100 men on it, set sail from Holyhead to come across to the Isle of Man. And it was a sunny afternoon, visibility was good. It was in December, so it got dark early, and eventually at about 5 o'clock they arrived at the Calf. And the 2 new wonderful lights on the Calf were guiding them. Now, they'd only been lit since January 1819, so they're only 3 years old. They had on board, apart from all these men, they had the captain, and they had William Suckling. They had the acting master, Henry Hodder. Now, the master is the man who actually steers the ship, looks at the charts and takes instructions from the captain. But they also had a pilot, a William Edwards. Now, if you're sailing in coastal waters you're not familiar with, you often take on board a pilot. And apparently this chap was a very experienced pilot. He'd been doing it for years and claimed that he knew Manx waters. So he was guiding them across. So when they got to the Calf at 5 o'clock, they turned north up the east coast. And at 5:20, the pilot saw a light to the port, to his left, and decided it was the light on the end of the pier here in Douglas. And he instructed them to turn in. Now, they were concerned about this. Mr. Edwards thought he was wrong, but what did they know? They had a professional pilot on board. They had to rely on him. They hadn't been in Manx waters before. And the light he saw, of course, was not Douglas. I mean, anyone would know you couldn't get from the Calf to Douglas in 20 minutes in those days. The sea was beginning to get rough. And as they turned in, someone on board saw white water and immediately knew they were at the coast. The pilot had said they were 7 miles out. So this is a story of complete incompetence on this man's part. They turned in and they hit the Skerens, which are rocks just submerged at the end of Dreswick Point, right at the end of Langness. And that's when the tragedy hit. 5:20 in the dark, a storm approaching, and they were wrecked. They lowered 2 boats and put most of the men in them, and they rowed away. They, of course, fired their rockets and distress signals. And the men of Castletown responded. Now, these are ordinary fishermen. These are ordinary men who didn't put their own safety first, and this is the heroic work that was also happening in Douglas Bay with Sir William Hilary, who founded the Royal National Lifeboat Institute. These are extraordinary men who straight away go to the assistance. So some of the men rowed across Castletown Bay, others ran out on Langness, and they arrived at the point. They could see the lights from the ship, the flares going off. They lit bales of straw. I mean, they're in pitch dark here with just little oil lamps. It's extraordinary. And one of their boats that they'd brought with them did a number of rescues, and it took most of the remaining crew off. It was just that the last rescue, the last time this little boat, Castletown boat, went out to the racehorse, it took a number of the crew in, but it was hit very badly by a wave and it capsized. And of course, in those days, believe it or not, sailors couldn't swim. We all, as children, go to the swimming pool and learn how to swim. You could be an experienced sailor and never been in the water. So these men, and in fair dues, it was pretty rough anyway, they were lost, as were 3 men from Castletown, tragically drowned. And a young lad from the ship had also been sucked overboard previously. So it was an absolutely tragic night. And it was only when the captain, who did survive, got ashore and the other men that they realised they were actually at Castletown. The pilot, before he crashed, said he thought they were up at Clay Head. I mean, the man had no idea what he was doing. He later claimed, when, of course, the inevitable inquest came, that he was mistaken by the light of Scarlet House. Now, if you go out to Scarlet, you go through Queen Street and along around the coast to where the car park is. You can walk up to the Wildlife Trust building and on. Scarlet House is a large house standing on its own, and apparently that night there was a wake happening. Captain Thompson, who'd lived there, had died. The house was lit up, and he thought, the captain, or the pilot rather, that this was the light of Douglas Harbour, and he turned in. Well, we've puzzled ever since how he could possibly have mistaken the faint oil lamps of Scarlet House to the very effective lighthouse down here on the Red Pier, built by George Stewart, who'd built the Castle Mona. It had one of these modern Argand lamps on, and it could be seen for 6 miles. But of course, if he thought he was 7 miles out, then it was just a complete mess.
And subsequently, presumably, the pilot did action get taken against him, or was he?
There was an inquest,
yeah.
And he admitted that he'd made a mistake. He admitted he'd made a mistake. He claimed, as I say, that the lights were from Scarlet House, and all that happened was that he was reprimanded, and he was fined, and the pilot, the master Henry Hodder, was also reprimanded, because he hadn't done depth soundings, which he should have done, which would have told him how close he was to the coast. So those two were merely reprimanded. That's all that happened. Rather like the SIB inquiry. Nothing much seems to happen afterwards. Of course, the locals immediately started a charitable fund for the widows of the 3 men. And they contacted the Admiralty, and I think it was the first time ever the Admiralty, in recognition of the heroism of these men in saving Royal Naval men, that they gave a pension for life to the widows. But the other side of the story is there was a small amount of looting went on. One of the sailors himself was caught selling off copper and bits and pieces from the boat, and others were fencing it, if you like, and they were put on trial. And it's not clear whether they were actually transported or executed, but it was a very serious offence in those days. So that was a rather something of a stain on the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that sort of thing, looting, would have happened. It would have been quite common. And as you say, with 50,000 wrecks, it would have been something that the people of the Isle of Man would have been familiar with.
Yes, but I don't think we did what some of the Cornish were famous for. They were known as the wreckers because they used to light lights on the shore to misguide ships, thinking it was a harbour light, and they were then deliberately wrecked, and then they were pilfered. I'm not sure there's any record of the Isle of Man doing that.
No, that wouldn't be the Manx way at all. No. So it's. I mean, it really is a very important commemoration. This. I mean, the scale of that sort of wreck. I mean, the vessel itself it would have been quite an important vessel for the Royal Navy. So they must have. It must have been quite a blow for them to lose that boat.
Absolutely. There is this letter that the captain, Captain William Benjamin Suckling, he wrote from, I assume, a room in the George Hotel where they were put up that night. I mean, this is not a letter that any captain wants to write, but he begins, Sir, with the utmost upset, I have to report to you the loss of His Majesty's sloop Racehorse. You know, when they opened that in London days later, they must have thought, what is going on over there? First the Vigilant, now the Racehorse. I mean, how are we going to get out of this? But I suppose they were inured to these wrecks. They were so common. And what was happening in Douglas Bay, as I said, with William Hilary, if you read those accounts, they are extraordinary. How dangerous it was. You couldn't go from the Isle of Man to Holyhead and actually be sure you were going to get there. There's an occasion when one of the Dukes of Atholl came over here, and it took him a week to get here, to Derby Haven, blown backwards and forwards. Thank goodness we've got the steam packet today.
Indeed, yes. I'm sure that the steam packet will manage to get you there in more than a week, or less than a week, I should say.
Yes.
Well, it is fantastic, and of course the exhibition will be taking place down in Castletown, so people can go and find out more there.
And there's the cannon, of course. There is a small cannon which I think is being remounted, which the divers who started in the late 1960s to salvage the wreck. But reading the description of the boat, there must be another 17 cannons down there somewhere, because if it was a fully armed sloop, it will have had 18 cannon on the deck. They're only small, and you'll see it if you go to the exhibition. So there's probably still a lot more down there, but of course currents are extraordinary around there, and I know the pottery that was picked up has been examined by Dr. Peter Davey, and he's found that the pottery doesn't all come from the Racehorse. A lot of it is from a much earlier date. So investigations are going on now to see which other ships were wrecked along there. And of course there'll be many that probably aren't recorded. So that's an interesting avenue of exploration still to be explored.
Former MHK Tony Brown explains why he got involved with the commemoration.
Well, it's interesting really because it actually goes back to my early days in MHK. And Moira, who was one of the divers who lived in Ballasalla, used to come to my constituency surgeries, and this was just as they'd gone down looking for artefacts. And she used to come in with photographs they'd found. So I took an interest then. I didn't know anything about the Racehorse until then. And then it drifted on, things moved on. I moved on doing what I was doing, and nothing really happened except, I was advised about it. And then in the sort of 90s, there was a sort of talk about doing something to recognise it, and nothing came from that. And then I was speaking to Brian King, who was one of the original divers who actually located the wreck back in the, I think it was late 70s. And he was telling me about the 200th anniversary coming up this year, which I, again, wasn't really aware of. And he was concerned that there was nothing being done to recognise it. So I said to Brian, that's okay, leave it with me, I'll go and sort something out, and which is, as you know, is what I do. And I put together a small group, and we sat down and had a talk about it. And I have to say, we're a group of 4. 2 didn't know anything at all about it, and 1 did. And we went through it and all, and we came up with the idea of, on the 14th of December 2022, which is exactly 200 years to the day of the loss of the racehorse, that we would have a plaque unveiled in Castletown down on the quay. And that's what we've been working towards. And there are 2 things. One is the unveiling of a plaque, which is a public occasion, and the Lieutenant Governor is unveiling the plaque because, again, it links to a Navy ship. But the plaque also commemorates, importantly, not only the 9 men who lost their lives, but actually names the 3 men from Castletown who lost their lives, who went out to rescue people. So the whole event then is properly commemorated down on the quay.
And I suppose the thing that surprised me really is that there is no commemoration at all of this. There's no plaque. There's nothing really to mark what was well, in the words of your recent press release, quite a most significant incident at the time.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it had a lot of firsts. I mean, when the 3 Castletown men lost their lives, I understand that Sir William Hilary made representation to the Admiralty, and this is back in 1822. Don't forget, not much happened in those days in terms of looking after ordinary people. And he wrote to them, and the Admiralty agreed to give the widows, for the first time ever, the widows of men who'd lost their lives trying to save personnel, they weren't Navy men, gave them an annual pension. And the 3 widows then had an income which was lost because their husbands were lost. It also resulted in Sir William Hilary pursuing his call for a maritime life-saving organisation. And as we know, we have the Tower Refuge in the Isle of Man. The first sort of official lifeboat service was started in the Isle of Man. And, of course, subsequently, the RNLI was born. And, of course, in the year 2024, the RNLI will be celebrating their 200 years. We're pleased that there are going to be some people from the UK, from the RNLI in the UK, coming over for the event. They've been very supportive in offering any help that they can give, or just being supportive of what we're doing, because it recognises that as well to a degree. And the other thing that's happened out of this is that we've had one relative who's come forward from the UK, a relative of one of the Navy personnel who lost their life, and they're going to come over for the occasion as well. So it's really sort of developed in a way as better than we expected, I suppose, really. We've got original divers coming to the ceremony, and we've got other interested people who hopefully want to come along and see it. So we hope it'll be kind weather for us. It's December, so we don't know. If the weather is really inclement, then we'll transfer to the town hall for the unveiling. But everything's going well, and it's going to be, I think, really good that we actually have the commemoration. We're going to relocate the cannon at some stage to be located underneath the plaque. It's presently located in the Speaker's Garden, and we want to get a carriage made for it which will replicate what was the original carriage.
And, of course, the people who want to find out more and can't make the ceremony, there's the exhibition, which we're going to hear about from Alison Fox from M&H later in the programme. That exhibition, how long is that running for?
Well, the exhibition will be open to the public from the 15th of December through to the 30th of December, not open Christmas Day or Boxing Day, naturally, or the Sunday. And it'll be open from 11 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Relatively flexible. If there are people in, we're going to stay there. And we've had great support from the commissioners on doing that in the Civic Hall. And it'll be in the Town Hall, Civic Hall in Castletown. It's free, people can come along. There will be some unique artefacts there which are held by the museum, one being the buckle, and it's the only one in the world as far as we know, a Marine's buckle, which was found from the wreck. And there'll be pieces of guns and pieces of the equipment that they used to use on ships in those days, and we're hoping to have some guns that are from a local person on display as well, just to show the type of guns and cutlasses that they would have had in those days. And importantly, a gentleman's just made a new model of the racehorse, and that'll be on display as well. And Isle of Man Post Office, who've been very supportive, will have stamps on sale, and because they've done a series on wrecks anyway, and it happens to link into the racehorse as well, which they've got a stamp specially commissioned for that. So all in all, it should be a interesting place to come and have a look and find out a bit about the racehorse. And very importantly, from our point of view, we don't have the expertise. Very grateful to Manx National Heritage and Alison Fox for all the work that they've put in to put together the exhibition.
And in terms of Manx people, there were 3 Manx people who died, weren't there? Are you aware? Well, it'd be interesting, first of all, to hear who those 3 Manx people were. Next question: are you aware of who of any of their descendants? And if there are descendants out there that you're not aware of, presumably you'd be interested in hearing from them.
Yes, it would be. I mean, we've been looking at that. We've had one of our friends researching, and he's done a lot of research at the museum to see if he can link up to any descendants of those who died, the Castletown men especially. In fact, only the Castletown men. And really has not found anything. I mean, don't forget, in 1822 there were very little records of anything. And even in what he has found, there's been no one we've linked to directly as a descendant of any of the 3 men that lost their lives. The only connection we've had is a lady from the United Kingdom who her name is Mrs. Dodd, and she's related to one of the ship's crew that lost his life, and they're coming over for the ceremony. The men who lost their lives are buried in Maloo, some of them in unmarked graves, and some of them are marked. And there's going to be a special church service on the 18th of December at Maloo Church at 9:30 in the morning, so that'll be good. And I hope people will take the opportunity to go to that, because I think that they'll find it interesting. It's a church service, but Brian King, who was involved there, I think is going to speak on some of the background of the racehorse as well. The 3 men who lost their lives from Castletown, they were only young people, naturally, because what's what, and their name, if I just have a quick look here, Norris Bridson, Thomas Hall and Robert Quayle. And they lived in Castletown. Don't forget, in those days, Castletown only had a population of possibly 800 or 1,000 people. So the impact of losing 3 young men from Castletown had quite a big effect on the town itself. And these 3 men voluntarily went out in rowing boats to save the crew, or as many of the crew as they could. And in fact, it was on the last run that their boat overturned, and that's when they were lost. That's how the 9 men lost their lives. We were looking back in the 90s when I was chairman of the Manx Heritage Foundation at a scheme to put together to encourage people to put up plaques to events in the Isle of Man, of which there are numerous important events commemorated. And of course, time moved on and I moved on from that role, and we didn't get enough of it in place. And one of the ones that we did talk about was actually putting a plaque up for the racehorse. And unfortunately at that time we didn't progress it enough to be able to do that. So it's quite nice for me at this stage to actually now be coming to a stage where that view back in the 90s has come to fruition. And the link is still there because, of course, without the support of Culture of Annan, we couldn't afford the plaque, and they've been happy to fund the plaque that's going to go up on the wall for us, which we're very grateful for. And, of course, very grateful to the Department of Infrastructure, Harbours, because they've been very supportive as well, and the plaque's going to go on the end of the Harbour office in Castletown at the quay.
You're listening to Perspective. Alison Fox from Manx National Heritage told me why they got involved.
It was a number of people came to us, really. We were aware of the anniversary coming up about 2 years ago. We do things as far in advance as we can. And we were wondering about maybe doing some kind of digital offering. The artefacts that were raised from HMS Racehorse from the wreck site are within the Manx National Collections. So they're looked after at the Manx Museum. And we were wondering about maybe doing some digital exhibition or something like that to commemorate the anniversary. And then we were approached by Brian King. Brian got in touch a couple of years ago because of the anniversary. So we started talking to Brian, and then we were also approached by Tony and the Castletown commemorative group. So there was one of this sort of really nice kind of organic projects really that grew from a few people's different interests, but also this growing realisation that it is a really important part of the Manx National Collections, and this was a really good opportunity, 200 years to actually get the story out there and let people see some of the artefacts from the ship. We're very aware of the underwater heritage is something we all share. It's all very much part of our lives on an island, but it's very, very inaccessible because it's under the water. So we were really pleased to start talking with Brian and Tony, but also the Isle of Man Sub-Aqua Club as well. They own the site, they own the wreck site, and it was the club in the 1960s and 1980s who raised a lot of these artefacts and donated them to the nation as well. And this year the Sub-Aqua Club have been going out and they've been doing new survey work to capture the seabed of the wreck site and also some fantastic 3D underwater photogrammetry as well. So we realised there was this great opportunity to make this really significant wreck site far more accessible to people than it had ever been before, really.
And I suppose we've heard from Charles Gard, we've heard from Tony Brown. What, to your mind, is the significance of this particular wreck and the particular event?
I think there's a number of strands to this story. Firstly, it's the fact that it is the only legally protected wreck within Manx waters. Manx National Heritage have been working with local historian Adrian Corkill to incorporate his data into the Isle of Man Historic Environment Record. And Adrian has over 2,000 recorded shipwrecks on his database. And so the racehorse is just the only legally protected one at the moment. So that makes it significant in itself. The story around the racehorse, that classic tale of heroic rescue, but tragic loss as well, is something that's been played out around the coast of the Isle of Man for centuries. The racehorse is by no means the only ship that was lost in these circumstances and had rescuers lost as well, unfortunately. So it's really important to recognise that, I think. And then the final strand is that potential connection with the RNLI as well. Sir William Hilary, the Manx resident, although he didn't take part in the rescue for the racehorse, he'd taken part in lots of rescues of other ships, including HMS Vigilant, that the racehorse was actually coming over to help take back. And the racehorse is really seen as one of these catalysts that set William Hilary to work, and just being that determined to petition the UK government to say, look, these people are losing their lives, people are being left destitute, helping these people, there has to be an organisation put in place. And less than 2 years after the loss of the racehorse, there was what became the RNLI.
So moving on then to talk about the actual exhibition itself, what can people expect to see, and what's likely to be the treasure that's going to encourage them down there to look at this exhibition?
I think firstly the story. We tell the story in the interpretation, so we'll have that side of things, but we will have a number of the artefacts that were raised from the seabed as well, and there's some really quite poignant artefacts in there. We've got things like shoes and buttons. We've got the very personal items, a spoon and a fork, which sort of sound very day to day. But these are one of the few remains of this 100-foot ship that was lost off the Manx coast. And likewise, we have the few remains of the ship as well. So we've got some of the ship's equipment, things like some of the blocks that would have held the rigging together and that would have worked the sails. So we've got parts of this, as I say, once, pretty huge ship that now really there's not much left to see.
Because of course where the wreck site is, there's some fairly strong currents around there, which is presumably why the wreck site is where it is. Yeah,
I mean, even going around today, when the tide's in full flow on a boat with an engine is fairly terrifying. So, in the days of sail where there were no engines to help, there were no brakes on ships, that particular part of the Isle of Man is particularly treacherous, and the seabed around there as well, as we know from the underwater filming done by the Isle of Man Sub-Aqua Club, is really quite deep and narrow gullies. So it's not this sort of nice sandy flat seabed there. So a lot of these artefacts were trapped within these gullies, and just the footage that people will be able to come to the Castletown Civic Centre and see will give some indication of actually how claustrophobic it is down there, not just being underwater, but how the divers have to negotiate these narrow gullies to get in and around the wreck site itself. Structurally, there's nothing left of the ship. There was salvage work done a few years after the ship was lost and over the years. And as you say, you know, the tides and the coastline around there is particularly treacherous. So there's no shipwreck as such under the water anymore, just the remains of what was once there.
And in terms of the artefacts, I mean, there's all kinds of things that I can see from the picture that you've got, presumably of some of the items that are going to be there. There are things there that look a little bit like keys, is that right?
Yeah, there's all this sort of, random collection of things. That the ship was, it was a home to, about 100 crew. You know, they were on the ship for weeks, months on end sometimes. So they had the personal possessions. But there are also official things. So there's a few keys there. And a lot of the items are actually marked with what's called the broad arrow mark or the crow's foot, which is sort of a three-pronged arrow, which signifies that whatever it is belonged to the UK government. It was property of the UK government. And that's the kind of thing that helped identify this as being the site of the racehorse itself and not another ship that had, come to grief around that site. So there's some really interesting things. And I think one of the things for me is the lack of structure of the ship. As I say, this ship was 100 foot long. It was home to over 100 crew. 200 years later, a lot of the things that we have in the national collections fit into display cases. And some of them are recognisable. People will see parts of muskets that have been brought up from the seabed, musket balls, a cannonball. But there's other things there that, have really suffered being on the seabed for so long and have just been battered about in the gullies and with the tides. And I think that's quite a poignant reminder of the power of the sea and what it can do.
Not sure now, was it Tony or Charles mentioned that one of the guns is has been rescued, but this was an 18-gun ship. So does that mean there are 17 still down there, or perhaps they were salvaged at some earlier point?
Yeah, well, as I say, there was certainly some salvage done, I think about 20 or so years after the loss of the ship. But there is one cannon or carronade that people can still see today that's actually in the grounds of Castle Rushen, in what's usually known as Speaker's Garden. And it's on the main quayside entrance to the Speaker's Garden. And that was one of the carronades that was raised from the seabed. And, we can see from the 3D photogrammetry survey that was done this year, we can't see any cannon or carronades down there, but there are a few cannonballs still down there. So all these things find their way into these very steep and treacherous gullies. But it was an armed ship, but the best place to see one of the guns is the Castle Rushen Garden.
When the exhibition closes, the artefacts will be available to view digitally at the Eye Museum. Isle of Man Post has produced a series of stamps representing Manx wrecks, including the racehorse. Maxine Cannon told me all about producing stamps.
The team that bring it all together are exceptional, and our credibility worldwide has been recognised by the good and the great in the philatelic world, but also the feedback that we get from the people we collaborate with, that we always we set out to do our very best. And as my friend Dr. Tilbury said many, many years ago, Max, we never want to meet anybody in a queue in Marks and Spencer's and have to sink below the mince pies because we've done something wrong. So to do shipwrecks of the Isle of Man with so many knowledgeable people and to have had such good feedback is very pleasing for everybody involved.
And it's such an amazing, beautiful picture that Paul Parker has produced for you, particularly for HMS Brig Racehorse. It's fantastic, isn't it?
Well, when we first started the project back in October 2021, obviously Mr. Tony Brown had been on our case for a little while.
He's hard to say no to, isn't
very hard to say no to. And actually, it's our pleasure to recognise the significance of Racehorse in the history of the RNLI as well, because it was as a result of the sinking of Racehorse that Sir William Hilary saw the absolute need for a coordinated effort to save lives at sea. And this, therefore, is a very good forerunner to our stamp issue coming out in January 2024 for the 200th anniversary of the RNLI, where the Isle of Man is absolutely central to the activities of the RNLI in Poole, and to that extent they're sending two people from the area coordinator for the Isle of Man, and Angie Rook, who's leading the commemorations from Poole to the island next week to be part of the commemoration of Racehorse.
And that's fantastic too, isn't it, to have so many people who are interested in this. It's such a shame, isn't it, that, it's more than a shame, I think, that it's taken 200 years for proper recognition of the really heroic activity of particularly the three unfortunate people from Castletown who died.
I always say everything comes to he who waits long enough.
Well, yes.
And I say the effect it must have had on Castletown at the time, you just can't even imagine. So many good men lost, and some from, I think, same families. So to do it now and to actually have a visual record as best we can of the Racehorse. The painting was, we were guided by Adrian Corkle, who is the font of all knowledge on Isle of Man shipwrecks.
Yeah.
And he suggested that a sister ship, the Wolverine, of which there was historical reference, be used as the basis for the new painting. And I think Paul has just done such a wonderful job setting it in context on this, now over to the Manx pronunciation, Skarain Reef.
Yeah, Skarains, I would imagine Skarains, but yeah.
Skarains Reef at Langness Point. And so it's there now for future generations to enjoy, and through the support of Manx National Heritage, who have also collaborated extensively with us on this project, it's there for everybody to enjoy.
And it's such a beautiful picture, isn't it? I mean, it's, well, if you can describe tragedy as beauty, but it is the way Paul has done this. He's captured the sea, the roughness of the sea, but also the actual vessel itself.
Yes, totally. And anyone who's been out and about in the last couple of weeks and seen the magnificent, I know storms and not great things, but I actually think they're magnificent. If you're standing at a distance and you're not on the Isle of Man steam packet boat, then watching the waves and ships negotiating their course through the seas around our island, it's a joy to behold, actually, and that is captured in the painting, the sense of movement of the ship, albeit it was, it ended in tragedy, but to see it on a painting at this time and to be central to the to the exhibition that's unveiling that's taking place next week, and the commemoration. I do have to hand it to the people of Castletown and to the whole committee of the Racehorse Commemoration that they've brought so much together at this time in recognition of the 200th anniversary, and brought people who have a connection to it together. It's a great thing. And it was only a few days ago my husband reminded me about the sinking of the Ellen Vannon that also took place in December. So December's not a good month for boats.
No. Stay at home. If you're planning to travel by sea, stay at home.
Oh, not good news for the steam packet. So today we're recording it on the 8th of December, and as I was coming into the studio, it's absolutely a magnificent day. It's very cold and frosty, but clear blue skies, and I saw the Douglas fishing boat fleet coming in to the safe harbour of the Isle of Douglas after their day out fishing, and it just reminds you that 200 years ago, 1822 to 2022, the sea and what it means to the island.
Manx diver Brian King was partially responsible for finding the wreck.
It was a purely accidental. I was told about the wreck by Pat Chambers from Castletown, and he told me there was a gully, and he'd been out at Langness called Horse Gully, and he was told that by Ginger Brideston while they're in the glue pot. So
good authority then.
That was very good authority. And he had a date. He wrote to the Admiralty and asked them to check the date, and they came back and said, yes, it was wrecked on the Racehorse, wrecked on Langness in 1822. So Pat told me about it. He knew I was into diving, or just starting to dive. And I went to the museum, looked up the newspapers, and sure enough, there was the story of the wreck. And from then on, we decided to go and look for it with two friends. We went down to Langness, and the days when you could camp on Langness without asking anybody, we camped down there with, we had 2 or 3 tents, the Stiggants, the whole family came down with Brian, and I had Pete Frogley, who was the woodwork teacher from school with me, and Colin McQuillan, who was also a teacher from school with me. He was the boat handler, and all we did, we borrowed a 10-foot fiberglass dinghy and a small seagull outboard, and spent the week down there in gorgeous weather as it happened, looking for any sign of the wreck. We had a search pattern worked out, and we found one copper rivet, but that wasn't. We didn't realise that was actually part of the Racehorse. We were looking with visions of going around a corner, I suppose, and finding an intact ship like the old Spanish galleons, but that never transpired. Anyway, we didn't find anything that we realised was the wreck. And we packed up at the end of the week, and then about 3 weeks later, Brian Stigant, who was down with his mates John and Michael Corlett from Lexi, they were going past to dive on another boat, and they stopped off and had a quick dive, and they came across all this debris, which they immediately identified as being probably from the Racehorse, and that's how it was actually discovered, and we're talking about 1968.
And people, and anyone who could conceive of diving to try and find a wreck would assume that they'd be finding something that looked a bit like a boat, but it's nothing like that, is it?
Well, it can be, but the trouble is wooden boats deteriorated so rapidly. I mean, there are several wrecks around the Isle of Man that are made from the steam era, and they're semi-intact. But any wooden ship deteriorates very, very quickly unless it's buried under the sand. I mean, we had to work on to get experience when we eventually got permission to dive it and work it. We had to go and work on the Mary Rose, and of course that survived because it was buried under the mud. We found things on the Racehorse, pulley wheels, for example, that were partly buried in the sand, and the part underneath was perfect. The piece above was badly eaten away. But luckily, most of the stuff from the Racehorse was made of bronze. The wooden hull went, but all the fittings, or a lot of them, were bronze, and all stamped with the Admiralty crow's foot, which identified it as being an Admiralty ship.
And it must be quite a scary place to go and dive. Certainly, I mean, I put my toe in the water once a year, but even for an experienced diver, going down somewhere like where the strong currents are off Langness, it must have been quite an experience.
We got the hang of the tides down at Langness. It certainly on the flow, there's no way you can dive because it's coming up from the stack at Castletown and going across the point of Langness. But on the ebb, it comes down the outside of Langness and it tends to leave the inside corner, which is the screens, away from the tide. And diving down there, the first couple of times, you're a bit concerned about it, but actually once you've got the hang of it, it's great. But it's not like the Mary Rose was totally different. This is a massive gullies. It's like Hampton Course maze down there. Gullies, some are only 2 feet wide and some are about 30 feet deep. Some are about 6 foot wide and they go down from 10 feet down to 80 feet. And what people don't realise is there is seaweed only in the top 30 feet. So when you get near the top, it looks black and gruesome and all sorts of things down in there. You think there's some nice nasty fish trying to bite you. But actually, once you get below 30 feet, it isn't there. Although part of the wreck is actually in the shallows. But once you got used to it and got under the weed, it was quite exhilarating.
Yeah, I can well imagine. So, again, for people who don't dive, once you get under the seaweed, presumably it would be getting quite dark.
Well, it can be, but actually it depends on the weather when you're down. And there are times when, if there's been storms, the sea is quite churned up and there's a lot of sand and muck in the water and visibility isn't that good. But generally out there, it was superb. I mean, the shock we got when we went to the Mary Rose, visibility was a foot, if we were lucky.
Yeah.
But down on the racehorse, generally in the gullies, you're talking 30, 40 feet, which is excellent, really, for diving terms.
And again, diving, I mean, you talk about potentially as deep as 80 feet. What are the sort of constraints on a dive, in terms of how deep you can go and how quick you can come back up again?
Well, when you've got a cylinder of air, which you can get on varying capacities, but basically the deeper you go, the more air you use up. But working as times, we were working in quite 10, 15 feet, and we could work for an hour there and not have to worry about any decompression. But other times, if you were going down 70 or 80 feet and staying for any prolonged time, you would have to come up at a nice steady rate. Not decompress as such, but just come up at a nice steady rate. I once did a dive, the deepest I ever did was 42 metres out off Port Erin. And I remember there, I was with Alan Corlett from Peel Brickworks at the time, and I ran out of air at 42 metres, sat on the propeller shaft of the ring wall, and suddenly panicked when I realised and had to go like hell for the surface. But go like hell for the surface, we actually went up the rope and stopped at 10 metres, and I shared with Alan on the air. We've trained for that sort of situation, and then I had another 5 minutes at 5 metres, I think it was. But it was okay, as long as you know what you're doing and you don't panic.
Yeah. And I suppose the obvious question for people who, maybe it's not obvious to you, but to me it would be treasure. What was the greatest treasure as far as you were concerned?
I mean, when I started diving, I think everybody, there were galleons being found around Britain from the Armada and Florida Keys and places like that. And I suppose when I went down there, first of all, I was looking for treasure. But actually, in the case of the racehorse, we never found any monetary treasure. But I think the treasure is the history that went with it, the legacy. And now, as we know, the history of the RNLI being something that's occurred as a result of that. So it's played a major part in our history in the Isle of Man, and in fact nationally.
That was a perspective special about HM Brig of War Racehorse, which was wrecked at Langness on the 14th of December 1822. I hope you enjoyed listening to the programme as much as I enjoyed producing it. For now, though, I'm Phil Gaughan, Gonna Maius and Geisha-Grum. Thanks for listening.
But when you're near me, keep watch with